Hello, Stuart Kells. Thanks very much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS episode 99.
Thanks for having me.
Before we go into the detail of your wonderful new book, I thought we'd just quickly chat about your Scottish heritage.
I've got heritage on both sides of my family and also on my wife's family. My wife's father was from Fort William in the West, and my father's family, the Kellses, are from southwestern Scotland, and my father's mother's family, they're Fogos. You would know Fogos. They're from the southeast of Scotland. So we joke with our two daughters that they are the most Scottish, non-Scottish children around.
And where are you living at the moment?
I'm in Melbourne, in Australia.
Let's get stuck into your book then. Congratulations, seems to be doing really well. Alice, the biggest untold story in the history of money. Let's first of all, can we briefly introduce Alice to the audience? And it's not a person, it's a company.
Yes, we speak of Alice like she's a person, but she's a company and she's an invention, a kind of financial market. Alice really began in the 1980s and the 1990s with two insights. There were two insights that were had by an Australian inventor called Ian Shepherd. The first insight was that a lot of the big trends in finance at that time were connected, and that they were heading in the same direction towards this concept of a converged fundamental type of security, which was like an Arrow de Brue type security in the form of if an event happens tomorrow, I'll give you $1, and if the event doesn't happen, I won't. That kind of fundamental derivative type security. So there was that insight of convergence, and there was a second insight that the modern financial system was really built on quite shaky foundations. So that extended to things like the promise-based nature of a lot of contracts, the uncapped nature of a lot of derivative contracts, so they weren't properly collateralized, and generally the fragility of the underpinnings of key financial markets. So Ian came up with this new kind of market that was based on these Arrow de Brue securities that would address those uncapped exposures and therefore reduce systemic risks, that would properly collateralize transactions and address some gaps in markets and the fragility of markets. So it was a new kind of finance and a more democratic kind of finance, because all of those kinds of transactions didn't require the mediation of big banks, and they would be accessible to individuals and households as well as to corporates.
So that's what Alice was. Now, reading the book, there's two kind of main protagonists. I would definitely think Ian's more fundamental to the story, but could you introduce the two of them to them? There was Kate Jennings and then kind of Ian, who you've already kind of partly introduced as the inventor of Alice.
So Kate Jennings is also an Australian. She passed away a few years ago, but she's central to the story. She grew up in Australia around the same time as Ian, and they were both at Sydney University around the same time in the late 60s and early 70s. As you probably know, in the 60s, a lot of Australian writers and cultural figures went to London to make their names, whereas in the 1970s, Kate Jennings went to New York, and she continued writing there, did a series of jobs, and ultimately ended up working in a couple of the big banks, the big financial firms. She married a chap called Bob Cato, who was a graphic designer and a photographer. And then in 2002, Kate wrote a book called Moral Hazard, which was a novel. It was fiction, but it was quite closely based on her life, and really two threads of that. One was the latter part of Bob's life, because he passed away with Alzheimer's and she cared for him in his final years, but also Kate's work in finance and the sorts of things that she discovered, and the sorts of uncapped risks and the sorts of behaviours that we all saw coming to fruition in the GFC. So fast forward to the GFC, and just after that, Kate was writing a lot about problems in that world. She did a radio interview in Australia. Ian heard the interview and recognised who it was, reached out. They connected again and joined forces.
Within the story as well, you mentioned her husband, and I think some of the kind of real poignant moments in the book come from her adoption of a dog, because she'd kind of really missed that relationship she'd had with her husband. And I think that's a wonderful kind of thread that goes through. But there are other characters. A few dogs, I must say, are important to that story. But there's some other bankers who Kate worked for. And do you want to give us a little bit more of a flavour about that world that she saw? And also, when I was reading it, I was thinking, you know, we're supposed to not like bankers, but Kate speaks quite highly of them in terms of how she enjoyed their company compared to boring writers. And my question for you was, at the end of it, are we supposed to feel sorry for these bankers, or are we supposed to kind of just understand them, and I suppose in a more humanistic way?
Very much the latter. You're spot on. It's unusual to be able to write a book about finance and markets and have real people and real episodes and real human episodes in it. So I was very much attracted to this book because it allowed me to write about finance and some of these big issues that you touched on in a human way and in a narrative-based way. So yeah, you do get a different perspective on some of the bankers, but also some of the more remarkable characters are, you know, some of the lawyers and the patent attorneys and the, you know, very, very wealthy players in the legal system who pursue all sorts of different, you know, patents and things. So it's a real interesting mixture of characters, and it does humanize them a little bit. Yeah.
Getting back to kind of the functions of Alice and what it was supposed to do, throughout the book, there's this idea that Ian wanted to set up this kind of payments infrastructure and system as like a public utility, and that it wouldn't be owned by these big banks or even in the private sector. And this idea that the whole kind of international payment system was like a utility. He said in the book that someone said, no, utilities are just for the Russians. So there was clear distinction that if anything was to be of use, it should be owned in the private sector. And if it's in financial services, then it should definitely be owned by not just banks, but the biggest banks, and some banks in particular. Is that why the Alice project stalled? Because it wanted to do something that was much more built around the kind of public service rather than a profit narrative, and who would have been earning that profit?
It's a good point. I think if they had have been really narrowly focused on profit and getting it up and running really early, they could have done that, and they could have just run it on a sort of conventional commercial basis. But very much the philosophy was to pitch it in the first instance to central banks and governments as essentially a public utility, as you say. That didn't happen, in part because the timing wasn't great, because it was the 1990s and it was all about small government and privatization.
Deregulation, and yeah.
Exactly. So it ended up being partly funded by an Australian bank, National Australia Bank, but also working with partners like Standard & Poor's and a bunch of other key sort of market participants on a licensing type basis. So there was the invention was developed. It was first incubated at the University of Melbourne in a joint centre between IBM and the University of Melbourne, and there were a series of different international partners helping to test and develop it, including in the insurance market, because there are a lot of applications that allowed households to manage, you know, climate risk or retirement-related risk, things like that. So yeah, it got a fair bit of traction, but fundamentally, the idea of it as a utility was obviously not popular at the time with governments, but it was also potentially a threat to the big banks because it was a market that didn't involve the mediation of the big banks, and it would have made transparent a lot of activities that were very much not transparent in things like the over-the-counter derivatives market. So fundamentally, I think the banks were ill-disposed, the major banks were ill-disposed towards it.
I would encourage everyone to read the book. It's brilliant. I read it in a day. I thought it was really engaging. But to summarize what the Alice was, it was effectively a market. It was going to be an online tool where people could come and trade in various different products, but in that way it would have been very clear, and everything had to be backed by collateral. So if you wanted to, you had to prove that you were going to be able to pay the amount that you said you were going to be able to pay by showing that you already had those funds in an account. It was very much trying to kind of make it much of a less risky environment for people to trade. Is that a fair summary, or have you got a better one than that?
No, that's exactly right. It was Ian described it as a market in a crucible, that it was an unbreakable market. People had to stake sufficient collateral to cover the types of gambles and bets and positions that they were taking. And that really is the bridge between the Alice story and the wider story around money, because in order to have adequate collateral, Ian had to get right down into the foundations of what money was, and what kinds of risks attached to money, and ended up essentially saying that the kinds of collateral that had to be staked were really equivalent to central bank funds. And so he worked a lot with the central banks in different countries, and really got inside the wiring of the fundamental financial system.
Let's try and bring this all together then, and talk about kind of like the historical environment around Ian's invention, because it played out kind of starting in the kind of late 80s. You've got that SNL crisis in America, the BCCI collapse in 1991, which was the first kind of international finance story that I can remember being on the telly. Then you had Enron, which was about 10 years later, and then the great financial crisis. Can you kind of pull together the threads that Ian and Kate had kind of discovered through their similar but very different approach to what was going on in the financial services that you discuss in the book?
I think they both keyed into this idea of the excessive risk taking of the big banks and the big financial firms in the context of that too big to fail public guarantee. So there was a really a philosophy of privatized gains and nationalized losses, and that led to essentially the concept of why Kate called her novel Moral Hazard, because it's a fundamental moral hazard that if you ensure this extreme risk taking, then you're going to encourage extreme risk taking, and that's systemically dangerous, as we saw in the GFC, which was, as you well know, a crisis that emerged out of finance. It didn't come from somewhere outside the sector. So that concept of moral hazard, the risk taking, the dual character of derivatives, that they could be socially useful, but they were also inherently dangerous if they were uncapped and uncollateralized. So Ian's market was essentially a market free of moral hazard, because people would stake adequate collateral, those uncapped exposures would be removed, and the whole market would be robust and transparent. So that's why Kate and Ian were both avid students of all of those crises that you mentioned, and they really came.
They both had scrapbooks, didn't they? Did they both have scrapbooks? Yeah.
Well, Kate had a scrapbook, or a series of scrapbooks. Ian had this mega spreadsheet and database of all of the financial disasters and all sorts of developments in payment systems over several decades, which was extremely useful later on when he ended up in court.
Yeah, which we're definitely going to come back to Alice. But what I picked up again from the book was that after all these kind of crises, there always seemed to be a narrative, a very similar narrative that emerged. For example, the great financial crisis, lending criteria was just a little bit too slack. And actually, and as a side, if you read Austrian economists, there was too much lending criteria. That was the problem. But anyway, there's always a kind of shared narrative that it was something kind of within the system that was just slightly wrong and needed to be tweaked. Maybe there was a lack of regulation or other oversight. but it's this idea that someone had done something wrong, maybe even illegal, and people maybe pushed the envelope a little bit too far, but trying to innovate. The issue all would seem to be around people and not at a structural level. Why do you think that is? And could you delve into a little bit of what happened in Enron as maybe an example to back that thesis up?
Well, I think a large part of it is the large banks pursuing very, very cleverly a commercial strategy. And part of that commercial strategy was to fend off regulation, pardon me, to maintain a narrative of nothing to see here, to keep a veneer of confusion and a lack of transparency around things like the over-the-counter derivatives market, but also other sorts of transactions and other sorts of products. So it's very much in the big banks' interests, obviously, to fend off regulation and for there not to be a very clear understanding of where the money's coming from. And we can touch on this in a minute, but the foreign exchange market is a classic example of that. Most people don't realize that the underpinnings of foreign exchange trading and settlement are privately owned. They're privately owned by a small group of big banks, and they make a vast amount of money essentially for not bearing any risk at all. And this is very, very seldom scrutinized. It's scrutinized in this book, but that's pretty rare. And there's all sorts of other examples where the banks have positioned themselves very cleverly. There's a narrative of competition and a level playing field and private enterprise, but that's in large part nonsense. The playing field is very much tilted towards the big banks. The amounts of money that are involved make that a very valuable prize and worth defending, and they play very, very hard to defend it. So that's sort of this essentially why. Enron's an interesting example. People hold up Enron as exceptional and as a giant financial scandal. Part of what I say in the book, based on my research and Ian's research, is that Enron really wasn't exceptional. And the sorts of things that led to Enron's end were very much the sorts of things that happen every day on Wall Street, and that you can interpret in some ways the end of Enron as a competitive response from the big Wall Street banks against a competitor and against an interloper. And a lot of the sort of the dominant narrative around Enron really hasn't stood up when those matters have gone to court. In relation to the auditors and in relation to the CEO and in other instances. So there's a general popular understanding of what happened in Enron, but it doesn't really line up with where the courts ended up. And it's not really well-founded when you think about the sorts of behaviours and the sorts of conduct that happen every day in the larger banks. So it's a risky territory to go into, but the book does suggest, and I know other scholars, including other legal scholars in the US, have thought about this, but it does suggest a different interpretation of the Enron collapse.
I think really there's an understanding that the financial services system and structure is fundamentally sound, and that when things go wrong, it's because someone's done something, at an individual or maybe at a kind of corporate level, like with Enron. But fundamentally, everything's fine. And if you focus on those people who are clearly doing something wrong, then you're not focusing on all these huge issues that Ian and Kate both picked up on. And I think it is the kind of, no, look what's happening over there, so you don't look at what's happening here. I think that came through quite strongly in the book. But before we go back to the Alice story, you mentioned JP Morgan a couple of times in the book, and I think that's who Kate worked for. And the book kind of talks about the kind of like unwieldy power they've had for almost a century and a half, I think, in the US, and also affecting the global financial system. And there's a little quote in the book that I can't remember who it was that says from JP Morgan, but they said, no, they like a little bit of competition. And I kind of thought just enough to say that there was competition, but not enough to have any impact on what they was doing. That's the type of level of competition you would like in the supposedly capitalist market. Would you like to go into a little bit more detail about the role of JP Morgan in your story?
As you said earlier, the book personalizes some of these figures. So one of the key executives at Morgan is a character in the book, and is the chap who gave Kate Jennings her first dog. So there's a nice connection between her employment and the dogs and her personal story. The quote about I like a little competition is from JP Morgan himself. And at different times through that firm's history, they've really acted like a private central bank. Now, you know, there's few things more profitable than the concept of a private central bank, and it's really taxpayers and governments and the community have allowed them to do that. It's a very, very sound and smart commercial strategy to position themselves that way. And in the case of JP Morgan more recently, they've really skated pretty close to the edge on a few things. They've got a bit of attention in relation to the Enron collapse, in relation to the GFC, in relation to long-term capital management, and commodities trading, a few other things that have been in the courts. And they've been very, very clever at sort of exactly as we said before, of communicating there's nothing to see here, that they are a pillar of the financial system and a pillar of commerce, and that they're operating commercially. So looked at from a distance with a more neutral eye, it's quite amazing what they've been able to do. The amounts of money that they've made are extraordinary. The power that they've been able to accrete is extraordinary, and it's a business. It's a private business. So you do the math. That's worth a lot. They fight very hard to preserve that. It infiltrates into the political system, into the systems of regulation. Organisations like ISDA, the Derivatives Association, all of these organisations, CLS, which is the Foreign Exchange Settlement Body. JP Morgan has a big role in all of these sorts of organisations, and with a very, very clear and robust commercial imperative. So you can't really blame the bankers for doing that. They are operating in a system that allows them to do that. The message with this book, and I think with some of your work, is it's really up to the community and the body politic and governments to say, well, let's put limits on these things. Let's decide how big some of these institutions should be. Let's decide how profitable they should be. And let's decide what share of resources overall go to profit in the financial system, as opposed to productive pursuits or equity and fairness. So, one of your opening questions was, are we supposed to sort of like or dislike the bankers? Well, I'm quite neutral about the bankers. We've created the system, they're optimizing within it, and they're doing an extremely good job, an extremely lucrative job of optimizing within it. It's really up to us and politicians and governments to say, well, we want to put limits on this. And some of the confusion about banking and money really helps, it services the current dominant position of some of these big banks. So one of the optimistic kernels within this book is to say, well, if we really understand how this works, and we really understand some of the things that have happened without a lot of scrutiny, maybe we can think differently about how we regulate banks and financial markets, and maybe we can think about how we could design different kinds of institutions and different kinds of money even, and make a path to a different future. Because at the moment we've got this sort of neo-feudal model of vast amounts of money going to these institutions that it really isn't lined up with the services that they're providing or the risks that they're taking. It's really because they're making the best of their legacy position and their very strategic and clever moves in some of these key organizations. It really hasn't got much to do with commerce or capitalism as they're broadly understood. It's more about rent seeking and the use of commercial and organizational power.
Yeah. Going back to Alice then and JP Morgan. So the Alice system was kind of getting close to being up and running, but the big banks had kind of forged ahead, and they created their own kind of platform, which I think was CLS. Is that correct? And
Yes.
then someone noticed that actually there were parts of CLS that were clearly infringing on the patents that Ian had lodged in the States. And that's when the kind of story really takes off. So what happened? What did these big banks do when they realized that they were actually infringing on someone else's patent? Obviously, they just said, we're really sorry, here's loads of money, or we'll stop doing it. What actually happened?
Right at the beginning, when the infringement was identified, I think the banks were a little bit in shock. They were quite dismissive, but also they had a bit of a moment of shock, because they'd really overlooked the possibility that the activities that they're engaging in could actually be covered by a patent. It was a bit of a moment of realization. And then there was a long back and forth over several years of different kinds of communication, offers of licensing agreements. The Alice side were quite gentle and transparent in their approach. They'd already partnered up with other banks, including one that was a member of the CLS consortium. They'd partnered with Standard & Poor's. It wasn't like they were radical outsiders a long way from the center of the financial system. They had connections back to McKinsey and to central banks and main commercial banks as well. So they were very much insiders. It wasn't a sort of a shakedown. It wasn't a patent troll. It was a real enterprise, a real invention. And so they had this back and forth over several years, but as you know, it didn't end in any kind of agreement.
Let's push ahead then. So there was no agreement. It went to litigation in the US, and there's quite a big chunk of the book kind of concentrating on what happened in that incredibly convoluted process of trying to litigate, which eventually ends up at the Supreme Court. And again, with all the kind of peacocking and showboating when everyone who's there, it was it's fascinating. And I think Kate in the book said it was just such a privilege getting inside to see this, because it just looked so kind of unreal. And at the end of it, everyone was saying, is that it? What did happen at the end? How did Ian win? Was his idea of was his patents that been protected, and how did it end in that litigation?
Sure. So the patents themselves in America had been approved, obviously, by the US Patent Office. There was a series of Alice-related patents. They were found to be valid in some lower courts, but ultimately on appeal, the matter reached the Supreme Court. Very, very unusual for any matter to be considered at the Supreme Court. Less than 1 or 2% make it that far. So it shows you the sorts of issues that were at stake. The legal arguments really went through a series of different phases. They began around who could you sue and who might be infringing and on what basis. But through the course of different judgments, it really boiled down to what kinds of invention could be patented at all, and what kinds of computer-based software related inventions could be patented. Once it got into that territory, it was in the territory of Google and Amazon and IBM as well. So they all joined in. So you had the biggest banks in there. You had the biggest Silicon Valley participants. You also had big corporates from the pharmaceuticals industry and consumer products getting in there as well. You had the US Solicitor General joining in. So it went from a small invention in Australia all the way to the highest court in the world, with the largest banks in the world and the largest internet and IT businesses in the world. So it was an extraordinary arc, an extraordinary experience for maybe half a dozen Australians surrounded by 1,000 or so Americans in the court. And you can imagine how that felt. And yeah, as you indicated, it all happened very, very quickly, ultimately at the end. And where the court landed, I don't want to give too much away, but where the court landed really opened a can of worms, not just for Alice and for financial invention and financial inventors, but it wiped out whole categories of IT-related inventions, software-related inventions. So whole portfolios held previously by companies such as IBM, Microsoft, Google disappeared because they were basically unprotectable and unenforceable. So this small invention from Australia with big ambitions ended up being central to a case that really wrought a fundamental change to American law. And those sorts of implications are still being worked through. There's a proposal in the American Parliament to legislate to restore some of the rights that the case knocked out. Yeah, this is a very much a live issue.
Let's say you've kind of got a mainstream economic view that kind of owing to something like the efficient market hypothesis and various other theories that financial crisis can be avoided, although anything that happens is kind of external shock or maybe market failure, but all these things can be avoided. And then you've got this kind of heterodox approach, which is the one that I support, that says, look, crises are just baked in, they're inevitable, they're kind of part of the system, or even part of capitalism, which is kind of a Marxist view. Once you read the book, where do you think someone who's not got a position on either of those two perspectives would end up after reading this story?
Very much that crises arise, from the workings of the financial system that we've got. So part of what you're touching on there is, the sphere of modern monetary theory and the nature of money as well. And I think even more fundamentally in what you're talking about, if people read this book, a lot of things that people feel around about, like trying to theorize about how money works and MMT and things like that, this book actually gives you the answer. It explains how money works. It explains directly what the risks are that come out of the financial system, such as in relation to promise-based trading, uncapped risks, gaps and weaknesses between markets, misunderstandings of how banks and finance work. So it really sets it out quite directly. So my sense of the MMT world, which is overlapping and adjacent to the work that I'm doing, is that it's keyed into some issues in the dominant economic conversation, rightly so. It's rightly keyed into those, but it hasn't quite nailed what they are. This book describes directly what they are. So it actually explains the mistakes that people make about money. It explains the kinds of risks that are coming out of the financial system. And in a gentle way at the end, it charts a potential way out of that as well. So hopefully people reading it will, if they're interested in frontiers in money and they're interested in modern monetary theory, they'll read this and then they'll progress in their understanding of how it all works.
if you look at it like a system, if you think about it as like the, I don't know, or maybe even the foundations of your house, if you take these kind of analogies to the story that you tell, you realize how just incredibly shaky the whole system is. And this idea that it can be supported solely by rational decision making of the people who are involved in the system, which is effectively what underpins this whole neoclassical view of the financial services system. And also kind of secondary to that is that you can look at any choice and you can measure it in risk. You can say there's a 10% chance of that happening. And a heterodox approach says this is just not how the financial system is supported. Everything is based around uncertainty. You don't know what the outcome is, so it's not a risk-based factor when you're looking at this this whole structure. And also people are so influenced by each other and so individually motivated, and this idea that they're all kind of harangued together by this idea of acting rationally. You see that in the story, that the financial services system just works in the way that a heterodox economist would describe it, and not in the way that the mainstream. What you can also pick up, I think, in the book is these something bad happens and there's a little bit of a reaction to it, and then after a period of time it kind of has a little bit of impact, so the regulation kind of disappears again, and then there's a bit of a crisis and there's more regulation, and then the regulation disappears again. And I definitely think that Ian could see that when he was charting all of those, to all those clips in that database. Is that something that you saw when you looked at all of these stories and thought there's clearly a pattern here with this regulation, and then removing that regulation in relation to the crises that happen?
Yes, absolutely. There's a pattern, and very similar events recur over time. And partly it's that what we touched on before around the big banks cleverly influencing regulation and cleverly diverting attention away and preserving their fundamental patch. But I think even more fundamental than some of those theories and some of those ideas around behaviors and incentives, there's a basic misunderstanding of money, and that has intruded into mainstream economics. A lot of what we think of as standard pillars of fiscal economics and international economics and welfare economics are based on an intuitive understanding of money and banking that is false. And we're not saying that as an outside theory or as some sort of not well-founded critique. We're saying that very much from the centre of this kind of discipline, that people have latched on in the discipline to an intuitive idea of money and banking that leads to things like fractional reserve banking and the idea of bank runs and the idea of taxation being collected and aspects of foreign exchange trading, which are basically not how, in a fundamental way, they're not how the world works. And so basing models and basing policy and the public debate and the discipline on a foundation which is essentially just a nice, tractable, intuitive illusion is fundamentally unsafe. So, as I said, the MMT people have keyed into part of that. They haven't got the full picture. They've characterised aspects of money creation without thinking about aspects of money destruction and where money creation happens, and various other factors that should be more prominent, I think, in their thinking. But they've certainly keyed into this basic error in the middle of mainstream contemporary economics and all the things that are built on that, including policy debates and the mainstream way that central banks approach their work. So that's a big issue, right? And it's exciting and important to be in the middle of that, to say, well, we do need this other conversation. Stephanie Kelton, who's a very good practitioner in the MMT field, she went on the Daily Show in the US today and did an excellent interview. And she repeated my line from my Guardian piece recently, that we need an adult evidence-based conversation about money in order to make progress in this sphere. Now, she's 100% right to say that, but she shouldn't have to say that. It shouldn't be Stephanie Kelton or Stuart Kells or Ian Shepherd saying, yeah, we need a new conversation about money. It should be the people who are actually working in and on the system, because you and I understand this, and Stephanie Kelton has got a good handle on money, but the people who are running the central banks and the large private banks and the treasury departments, they understand it too. And they're the ones that should be really having an adult conversation with the community to say, this is how it works, this is how it might work, and really take control of the future of this space with the community.
Yeah. Within the book, you speak about the actions of financial services being contrary to taxpayers, but I suppose more generally the public, and also society as a whole. Do you just want to kind of give us a little bit more of your kind of reasoning for saying that?
Well, it's very much the sorts of things we've touched on. So it's taking those uncapped gambles at the public expense, the risk taking under that too big to fail guarantee. It's fending off competition and playing very hard to fend off innovators and competitors that might cut into the profitability and the special positions of some of these big banks. It's maintaining fragile systems, but that still serve the interests of the big banks, so they can clip the ticket and they can earn rents, but with a cost in terms of fragility, and ultimately that cost comes back to taxpayers and the community.
Stuart Kells, thanks so much for joining us on this interview. We look forward to hearing about your new work in the next couple of years. Thanks very much. Bye for now.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.